I thought this was just another rich family story. Until this happened. Billionaire. His maid. His fiancée. 3 people standing on the same platform, but only one of them knew what was really about to happen. What started as a quiet engagement weekend at an old train station turned into something no one in that family will ever forget. A woman was tied up. A woman was blindfolded. And a train was coming. But nobody, not even the man who thought he had everything, knew the real reason why. Stay with me because by the end of this story you will never look at loyalty the same way again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. I read every single one. Today's story is one of the most emotional and twist-filled ones we've ever told. About money, betrayal, and a kind of loyalty that money simply cannot buy. Stay till the end because the ending will hit you harder than you expect. Nobody at that party knew a woman's life was already in danger. Daniel Cole was 34 years old, and by every measure that mattered to the world, he had already won. He owned a real estate empire that stretched across 4 states, with glass towers in cities he had once only seen in magazines. His name was on the side of 2 hospitals he had personally funded, not because he wanted credit, but because he remembered too well what it felt like to sit in a waiting room with no money and no options. Magazines called him the quiet billionaire, because he never gave interviews, never posted his wealth online, and never let anyone forget where he came from. Where he came from was a small apartment above a laundromat in Ohio, the kind of place where the pipes rattled all night and the heat never quite reached the back bedroom. He was raised by a single mother who cleaned houses to pay rent, who came home every evening smelling of bleach and other people's floors, who never once complained in front of her son even when her hands cracked and bled from the cold water in winter. That mother passed away when Daniel was 19, a sudden illness that the family couldn't afford to catch early enough, and the woman who stepped in to help him through college, through grief, through every hard year after, was Grace Whitfield. Grace wasn't family by blood. She was the housekeeper his mother had worked beside for years, cleaning the same string of houses on the wealthy side of town, riding the same early morning bus. When Daniel's mother died, Grace didn't walk away the way so many people in his life eventually did. She kept showing up. She helped him fill out scholarship forms at the kitchen table, sounding out unfamiliar financial terms with him line by line. She sat in the hospital waiting room the night he had his appendix removed because there was no one else to call, and she was the one who signed the paperwork because he was too scared and too alone to do it himself. 15 years later, when Daniel built his empire from nothing but stubbornness and sleepless nights, the very first thing he did, before the cars, before the properties, before any of it, was ask Grace to run his household. Not as charity, not as a favor to an old family friend, but because he trusted her more than almost anyone alive, and because some debts of love are never meant to be paid back in money, only in loyalty. Grace was 34 now too, the same age as Daniel, though their lives had gone in completely different directions since those days above the laundromat. She lived simply, in a modest cottage on the edge of the estate, and still sent money home every month to her sister in Georgia, who was raising 2 kids alone. She still wore her mother's old wedding ring on a chain around her neck, tucked beneath her collar where no one could see it, because she had never been able to afford, or wanted, a real one of her own. To the household staff, she was warm but firm, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and also noticed the moment a job was done sloppily. To Daniel, she was something closer to family than most of his actual relatives, closer than the cousins who only called when they needed something. Then came Vanessa Hale. Vanessa was 30 years old, elegant, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make every head turn without seeming to try at all. She came from old money, the kind of family whose name appeared on university buildings and museum wings, whose ancestors had been founding members of country clubs before most immigrant families were even allowed through the front door. When she and Daniel got engaged after 8 months of dating, the tabloids called it the wedding of the decade, a union between new money's rising star and old money's golden daughter. But from the very first week Vanessa moved into the Cole estate, something in the air changed. She was polite to Grace in front of Daniel, sweet, even, her voice honeyed and light. "Grace, darling, could you press my blue dress for tonight?" "Grace, sweetheart, the flowers in the east wing need changing, they're wilting terribly." Always a smile. Always a soft, practiced voice that made her sound generous rather than commanding. But when Daniel wasn't in the room, that softness disappeared like mist burning off in the sun. "You do understand your place here, don't you?" Vanessa said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the linen closet while Grace folded towels, her tone suddenly flat and cold. "Daniel might treat you like some kind of family. Sweet really in a small way. But you're staff. And staff who forget that tend to find themselves looking for new jobs rather quickly." Grace said nothing. She simply kept folding, her hands steady even as her jaw tightened. She had learned a long time ago, scrubbing other people's floors before she ever set foot in this house, that some battles weren't worth fighting with words, especially not with someone who held that much power over her future. She nodded once, quietly, and kept working until Vanessa's heels clicked away down the marble hallway. What Grace didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Vanessa had already started making calls. Quiet ones, careful ones, made from the privacy of her dressing room with the door locked. Calls to old family contacts, calls to people who owed her father favors from decades of business dealings, calls meant to make sure that by the night of the engagement gala, the biggest social event of the Cole family's year, the night that would formally announce the merger of two empires disguised as a wedding announcement, Grace Whitfield would no longer be a problem standing in the way. The gala was set to be held at Ridgeline Station, a beautifully restored 1920s train terminal that Daniel's company had renovated into an event space 2 years earlier, transforming a crumbling piece of industrial history into one of the city's most sought-after venues. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A giant brass clock hanging above the entrance, ticking the same steady rhythm it had for over a century. Golden light spilling from restored chandeliers onto anyone who walked beneath them. And just beyond the old platform doors, real train tracks still in daily use. Tracks that carried the last night train through the city at exactly 11:45 p.m., a detail most guests would never think twice about. Vanessa had checked the schedule twice. The night of the gala, Ridgeline Station glowed like something out of an old movie, the kind of scene Grace had seen printed on postcards but never imagined she'd help build with her own 2 hands, year after year, event after event. Golden light poured from restored chandeliers onto 300 guests in tuxedos and gowns, their voices blending into a low, elegant hum beneath the vaulted ceiling. A string quartet played near the grand staircase, the same staircase where Daniel had once stood as a young man touring the abandoned station with an architect, dreaming out loud about what it could become. Daniel stood near the center of the room now in a soft pink suit. His mother's favorite color, something he wore every year on the anniversary of her passing, though almost no one at the party understood why, and he never bothered to explain it to those who didn't already know his story. Vanessa was on his arm in a deep red gown that trailed slightly behind her on the marble, smiling for photographers, playing the part of the perfect fiancée flawlessly. Her laughter perfectly timed to every joke, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm in a way that photographed beautifully. Grace was there too, though not as a guest, and she had long since made peace with that distinction. She was overseeing the final details in a simple black dress that let her move quickly between the kitchen and the hall, making sure the catering ran smoothly, that the servers knew which tables belonged to which sponsors, that the flowers Daniel had specifically requested, white lilies, his mother's favorite, a detail Vanessa had rolled her eyes at when she heard it, were placed correctly near the entrance where his mother's photograph quietly sat on a small table, a private tribute Daniel insisted on at every major event. It was exhausting work, the kind that left her feet aching by 9 o'clock, but Grace didn't mind. She had helped plan every important event in Daniel's life for over a decade. His college graduation dinner, the opening of his first office, the ribbon cutting for the first hospital wing. This one wasn't any different, or so she thought, walking briskly past clusters of guests who barely registered her presence. At around 9 p.m., Grace received a text from an unknown number. Package for Mr. Cole needs signature. Service entrance, platform 3. Urgent. It wasn't unusual. Deliveries for events like this came in constantly. Last-minute floral arrangements, forgotten equipment, wine shipments delayed by traffic. And Grace often signed for things herself rather than pulling a server away from guests during the busiest hour of the night. She glanced at the message twice, noted the urgency, and slipped away from the main hall without telling anyone, exactly as whoever sent it had hoped she would. She walked quietly toward platform 3, away from the noise of the party, her heels echoing against the old marble in a hallway that grew progressively dimmer the farther she walked from the ballroom's lights. The station had a different feeling back here. Older, colder, the smell of rain still lingering from earlier that evening on the platform's open-air sections. There was no package. There were 2 men waiting instead, standing in the shadows near a stack of old shipping crates left over from the renovation. What happened next happened fast. A hand over her mouth before she could even process what she was seeing, a cloth pulled tight over her eyes, rope binding her wrists before she could scream loud enough for anyone to hear over the distant music. She was pulled toward the far end of the platform, past the old ticket booths, into the shadows where the security cameras, conveniently, had been disabled 20 minutes earlier by someone with inside access to the building system. Someone who knew exactly which panel to access and exactly how long to keep the footage looking uninterrupted on the monitors inside. Someone who had once worked in event security for the Hale family. A man named Marcus Reyes who had been quietly paid an amount of money that made his hesitation disappear within a single phone call. Someone Vanessa had called personally that morning, her voice calm and businesslike, as though she were arranging catering rather than a woman's disappearance. Back inside the gala, Vanessa checked her watch. 9:47 p.m. Right on schedule. She smiled at a passing photographer, tilting her chin at exactly the angle she knew photographed best, and slipped her arm tighter around Daniel's. "Everything all right?" Daniel asked, noticing her sudden brightness. The way her smile seemed to widen just slightly too much for the moment. "Everything is perfect," Vanessa said, and meant it in a way that made her stomach twist just slightly, though she pushed the feeling down the way she'd been taught to push down every inconvenient feeling since childhood. "Tonight is going to be a night we never forget." She wasn't lying. She just wasn't telling him the whole truth. Grace, meanwhile, sat on the cold platform floor, blindfolded, wrists bound, breathing hard through the fear rising in her chest like water filling a room. She could hear the faint sound of the party in the distance. Laughter, music, the clinking of champagne glasses carrying strangely on the night air. And she understood with a sinking heart that whoever had done this had planned it carefully. They knew the schedule. They knew the cameras. They knew exactly when the last train came through, and exactly how close to the platform's edge they had left her. She had almost 2 hours before that train arrived. 2 hours to somehow get free. Or 2 hours until Vanessa Hale's plan was complete. This is where everything changed. Because what Vanessa didn't know, what nobody at that gala knew, not even Daniel, was that Grace Whitfield was not just the housekeeper. Grace had been holding on to a secret for almost a year, one she had never found the right moment to share, turning it over in her mind late at night the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you should lift. 6 months before the engagement, Grace had discovered something buried in an old filing cabinet, while helping Daniel's lawyer organize his late mother's personal records for an estate review. A letter, yellowed at the edges, handwritten in careful old-fashioned script, dated almost 35 years earlier, signed by a name Grace recognized instantly because it was the same name printed in brass on half the buildings in the city. Warren Hale. Vanessa's grandfather. The letter revealed a decades-old business betrayal. A deal in which Warren Hale had secretly forced Daniel's mother's family out of a small piece of land using threats disguised as legal pressure, land that decades later became worth millions once the city expanded outward and the railway district was redeveloped. It was, Grace realized with a chill as she read it a second and third time, the very land the train station gala was standing on. The Cole family had once owned it. The Hale family had taken it, quietly, legally on paper but not in any way that could be called honest. In other words, the Hale family's fortune had partly been built on land quietly taken from Daniel's family before he was even born, before his mother had ever scrubbed a single stranger's floor to survive. And the woman engaged to marry Daniel, the granddaughter of the man who did it, had no idea her fiancé's housekeeper knew the truth, sitting on it like a lit match she wasn't yet ready to strike. Grace hadn't told Daniel yet. She wanted to be certain first, because she understood better than most how much damage half-truths could cause a person already carrying enough grief. She had quietly hired an independent historian to verify the land records, corresponding through a private email account, waiting for the right moment to bring it to Daniel gently, without hurting him unnecessarily right before his wedding, without letting old wounds reopen at the worst possible time. But someone else had found out first. A cousin of Vanessa's, working in the family's legal office downtown, had noticed the same missing documents Grace had requested copies of. Old land surveys, transfer records, a name repeated too many times to be coincidence, and panicked, calling Vanessa's father before he'd even finished reading the file. Word reached Vanessa within days. The housekeeper knows about the land. If it got out before the wedding, in front of the press, in front of Daniel's board members who were also major investors in the Hale family businesses and had staked considerable capital on this merger disguised as a marriage, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could collapse the entire merger the marriage was designed to secure. Because that was the real reason for the engagement. Not love. Not entirely, though Vanessa told herself different things on different nights. Vanessa's father had structured this marriage as a business alliance between two empires, something Vanessa had gone along with because she believed, in her own cold and practical way, that it was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked for women in her family. But she could not let a family secret threaten it. Especially not one that made her own family look like thieves in front of the very investors her father had spent years courting. So Vanessa made a choice. Not to confront Grace directly. Not to have an honest conversation, woman to woman, about what had been found and what it meant. But to remove the problem entirely. Quietly, cleanly, in a way that would look, if anyone ever asked, like the housekeeper had simply wandered off, overwhelmed by the stress of the big event, and gotten into some kind of tragic accident near the tracks. A story easy enough to tell. Easy enough for grief to smooth over within a year. Nobody would suspect the bride, dressed in red, laughing beneath the chandeliers. Grace didn't know any of this as she sat blindfolded on that platform, working her wrists raw against the rope. She only knew the truth was somehow the reason she was in danger, and that if she didn't get free soon, that truth might disappear into the dark along with her, buried a second time, this time for good. At 10:30 p.m., Daniel began to notice Grace was missing. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a small, nagging feeling, the kind that comes from years of knowing someone's habits so well that their absence feels like a wrong note in a familiar song. Grace never disappeared during an event she was managing. She was the kind of person who checked every detail twice, who would rather miss her own dinner than let a tray of appetizers go out cold. When the head server asked him a question meant for Grace, and no one could find her, Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced with this intensity since the night his mother was rushed to the hospital. "Has anyone seen Grace?" he asked, pulling aside one of the event coordinators. His voice already sharper than the moment called for. "Not since around 9:40, sir. She said she was going to sign for a delivery." "What delivery?" The coordinator didn't know, and neither, it turned out, did anyone else. Daniel excused himself from a conversation with 3 of his board members, ignoring Vanessa's hand gently pulling at his sleeve. Her fingers surprisingly firm for such a light touch. "Daniel, you're the host, you can't just wander off." "Give me 5 minutes, he said, already moving. Those 5 minutes became 15. He checked the kitchen, where pans still steamed but no one had seen Grace in almost an hour. He checked the loading dock, empty except for stacked crates. He checked the offices upstairs, dark and locked. No Grace. He tried calling her phone. It rang twice, then went straight to voicemail, which was strange, because Grace never let her phone die. Not on an event night, not ever, not in 15 years of working beside him. Something was wrong. He felt it the way you feel a storm before it arrives. Not with proof yet, just instinct, the same instinct that had once told him at 19 that his mother's cough was more than just a cold. He checked the security office next, badge in hand, and found the guard on duty looking confused, scrolling back through footage that simply wasn't there. "Sir, the Platform 3 cameras have been down since around 9:20. I thought maintenance took them offline for the renovation next month." "There's no renovation scheduled," Daniel said slowly, each word landing heavier than the last. He didn't wait for an explanation. He started walking fast toward the far end of the station, past the ticket booths, past the old iron gates that led out to the platform still in operating use. His dress shoes striking the marble with a rhythm that matched his racing heart. And that was when he heard it. Faint, almost swallowed by the wind sweeping through the open platform, but unmistakable. Voice. Grace's voice. Muffled but calling out raw with effort. He broke into a run. What Daniel didn't yet know was that Vanessa had followed him, slower, more careful, watching from a distance near the platform entrance. Her red gown gathered in one hand to keep it from dragging on the wet stone. She had not expected him to notice this quickly. She had planned for the discovery to happen after the train had already passed, after it was too late for questions, too late for anything but grief and a carefully constructed story about a tragic accident that no one would think to question on the worst night of a man's life. Now, watching Daniel sprint toward the tracks, she understood her plan was falling apart in real time, unraveling faster than she could think to stop it. And she had a choice to make. Stop him or let this play out and hope the timing still worked in her favor. Hope that somehow the train would still arrive before the truth did. She chose to stand still. To watch. Some part of her, even now, could not bring herself to physically intervene, though she also would not warn him. She simply stood at the edge of the platform in her red gown, arms crossed, waiting to see what would happen, as if she were watching a story unfold that had nothing to do with her, as if distance alone could make her innocent of what she'd set in motion. In the distance, the low horn of the 11:45 train sounded through the night, closer than either of them expected. Grace heard the horn before she saw the light. She had spent the last 2 hours fighting against the ropes, twisting her wrists raw, trying every trick she could think of to loosen the knots. Techniques half remembered from an old movie, from stubbornness alone, from sheer refusal to simply sit and wait for whatever was coming. She had managed to work the blindfold down just enough to see slivers of light beneath it, enough to know she was near the very edge of the platform, close enough to the tracks that the ground beneath her had begun to hum faintly with the approach of the train, a vibration that traveled up through the cold stone and into her bones. She screamed as loud as she could, though her throat was dry and raw from hours of crying and shouting into the empty dark. "Help! Somebody, please!" That was the sound Daniel had heard. He rounded the final corner of the platform just as the train's headlights swept across the tracks in the distance, still far enough away to give him time, but not much of it, the horn sounding again, longer this time, a warning. He saw her then, Grace, bound, blindfolded, pressed against the low barrier near the platform's edge, exactly where whoever had left her knew the train's motion and wind would eventually push her off balance, exactly where it would look, to anyone investigating later, like a terrible accident and nothing more. "Grace!" he shouted, sprinting the final stretch. His dress shoes slipping slightly against the wet marble from the earlier rain. His heart pounding so hard it hurt. "Daniel!" Her voice cracked with disbelief and relief, a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. He reached her in seconds, dropping to his knees on the cold stone, fingers working desperately at the rope, fumbling in the dark. His hands were shaking, not from fear of the train, though it was close now, but from the sight of the woman who had raised him in every way that mattered, tied up like she was nothing, like she was disposable. "Who did this to you?" he asked, voice tight with barely controlled rage as he finally loosened the rope enough to pull her hands free, the fibers leaving deep red marks across her wrists. "I don't know," Grace said honestly, ripping the blindfold off herself the moment her hands were loose, blinking against the sudden light of the approaching train. "Two men. They knew my schedule. They knew the cameras." The train horn blasted again, closer now, the ground vibrating beneath them with a force that rattled Grace's teeth. "We need to move now," Daniel said, pulling her up by the arm. Grace's legs had gone numb from sitting so long, and she stumbled, nearly falling back toward the tracks in a moment that stopped both their hearts. Daniel caught her, wrapping both arms around her and half carrying, half dragging her back from the platform's edge just as the train roared past, close enough that the wind from it tugged violently at his suit jacket and whipped Grace's hair across her face. They collapsed together against the old brick wall of the station, both breathing hard, hearts pounding, the train's lights flashing red and white across their faces as it disappeared down the tracks, and the roar slowly faded into the distant sound of the party still going on inside, oblivious. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Daniel simply held on to her, the way he had held onto her hand as a scared 19-year-old boy standing at his mother's funeral, not caring who saw him cry. "You're safe," he finally whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "You're safe now." But safe from what, and from whom, was a question that was about to get a very complicated answer. Vanessa was gone by the time Daniel carried Grace back toward the main hall, having slipped inside through a side entrance while the two of them sat recovering by the tracks, composing herself in a mirror in a private powder room, practicing an expression of concern she did not fully feel. Security had already been alerted, and within minutes, 2 officers who happened to be working private detail for the gala arrived at the platform, radios crackling. Daniel, still holding Grace steady, gave a clipped, furious account of what he'd found. The rope, the blindfold, the disabled cameras, the fake delivery message still glowing on Grace's phone screen once someone found it discarded near the ticket booths. "I want every camera in this building checked. I want to know who accessed the security system tonight," Daniel said. His voice low and controlled in the way that people who knew him understood meant he was more dangerous than if he'd been shouting, more dangerous than the tabloids ever gave him credit for. Grace, wrapped now in someone's coat, sat on a bench near the ticket booths while a paramedic checked her wrists, red and raw from the rope, cleaning the small cuts with careful hands. She was shaking, more from shock than cold, and Daniel refused to leave her side even as his phone buzzed relentlessly with calls from confused board members still inside the gala, wondering why their host had vanished so suddenly. "Daniel," Grace said quietly, once the paramedic stepped away to update the officers. "There's something I need to tell you. I think this might be connected to something I found. Something about your mother's land." Daniel frowned, kneeling in front of her, his pink suit stained with dust from the platform floor. "What land?" Grace hesitated, glancing toward the hall where the party continued, unaware, golden light spilling out from the tall windows like nothing in the world had gone wrong. "About 6 months ago, while going through your mother's old papers, I found a letter. It talked about a deal, a piece of land your family lost decades ago. Land that later became this station, this whole district." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly. The letter was signed by Warren Hale. Daniel went very still, the name settling over him like a weight. Vanessa's grandfather. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure," Grace continued, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I hired someone to check the records quietly. I didn't want to hurt you with something that might not even be true. Not right before your wedding. But if someone found out I was looking into it, then someone had a reason to make sure you disappeared before the wedding," Daniel finished, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity, each one landing like a stone in his chest. He thought back to Vanessa's strange brightness earlier that night, the way she'd checked her watch more than once during dinner, the way she'd tried to keep him from leaving the party to look for Grace with that unusually firm grip on his sleeve. He thought about how calm she'd seemed even as chaos broke out around them, how she hadn't asked a single question about where he'd gone or why. He stood up slowly, his jaw tight, and looked toward the grand hall where his engagement party. His fiancée was still, presumably, smiling for cameras as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Stay here with the paramedics," he told Grace gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face the way he might for a sister. "I need to go find out exactly what my fiancé knows." Grace reached out and caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who'd just been untied from a rope. "Daniel, be careful. If she really did this." "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I need answers. Tonight." The moment Daniel walked back into the gala, the entire room seemed to shift, conversations dying mid-sentence as heads turned toward him. His pink suit was dirted at the knees, his hair disheveled, his expression unlike anything the guests had seen from him before. Cold, focused, entirely unlike the composed businessman they were used to seeing in boardrooms and magazine profiles. Conversations quieted as he crossed the marble floor directly toward Vanessa, who stood near the champagne fountain with two of her cousins, laughing at something one of them had said, her red gown catching the light beautifully. Her smile faltered the instant she saw his face, a crack appearing in the careful composure she'd spent the last 20 minutes rebuilding. "Daniel, what happened to you? Are you Al? Where were you at 9:40 tonight?" he asked, his voice low but carrying enough weight that the people nearby fell completely silent, glasses pausing halfway to lips. Vanessa blinked, her hand fluttering briefly to her collarbone. I was here at the party, why would you?" "Security cameras on Platform 3 went dark at 9:20, Daniel continued, stepping closer, ignoring the growing crowd of guests now watching with poorly concealed curiosity. "Grace was lured there with a fake delivery message at 9:47. She was tied up, blindfolded, and left directly in the path of the 11:45 train. Somebody with detailed knowledge of this building's security system and this station's train schedule did that. Somebody who had a very clear reason to make sure Grace never made it to our wedding." Vanessa's face drained of color, but she tried desperately to keep her composure, her hands clasping tightly in front of her to stop them from shaking. "Daniel, I don't know what you're implying, but I would never." "I found the letter, Vanessa." Grace's voice cut through the crowd, steady despite everything. She had walked in quietly behind Daniel, still pale but standing tall, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, her wrists visibly marked even from a distance. "About your grandfather. About the land. I know you know I found it." Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers spreading faster than anyone could contain them. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. Men who, Daniel would later learn, were also major investors in Hale Enterprises and had far more riding on this wedding than a simple romance, men now quietly recalculating the risks sitting in front of them. "That's insane," Vanessa said, her voice rising, panic slipping through the cracks of her composure like water through a broken dam. "You're accusing me based on some old letter and a housekeeper's paranoia? I have security footage of the disabled cameras being accessed from a device registered to Marcus Reyes," Daniel said flatly, each word deliberate. "Your family's former head of event security. The same man you personally recommended I hire for tonight." Silence fell over the entire hall, so complete that the string quartet, unsure what else to do, simply stopped playing mid-phrase. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time all night, for the first time perhaps in her entire carefully managed life, she had no smooth answer ready. "You almost let a woman die," Daniel said, quiet now, but every word landing like a blow, "to protect a secret that was never mine to be ashamed of and never yours to bury." What happened over the next hour would be talked about in that city's social circles for years, retold at dinner parties with growing embellishment each time. Security escorted a still protesting Vanessa to a private office while police were called to formally investigate, her cousins trailing behind in stunned silence. Marcus Reyes, questioned separately at the station later that night, quickly confirmed under pressure that Vanessa had contacted him personally that morning, offering a significant payment to handle a problem before the wedding, though he claimed he never intended real harm, only to scare her and delay her. A claim investigators would later determine was, at best, a reckless understatement of what actually happened, given how close Grace had come to the tracks. The engagement, of course, was over before midnight. Daniel stood before his remaining guests, stunned, whispering, some already reaching for their phones to call reporters, sensing the story of the decade unfolding in front of them, and made a short, steady statement, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet hall. Tonight, someone I trusted tried to silence someone I love in a different way, but no less real, the woman who raised me when I had no one else. That will never be forgiven, and it will never be forgotten. Thank you all for coming. I think it's best we end the evening here. The Hale family's business alliance, so carefully engineered over months of negotiations, collapsed within days as news of the incident spread across every business page in the country. Several board members quietly withdrew their support, unwilling to be associated with a scandal involving attempted harm to an innocent woman. Warren Hale's decades-old land deal, once hidden in dusty files, became public record within the week, opening a legal case that would take years to fully resolve, but which ultimately restored, at least symbolically, what had been taken from Daniel's family so long ago, a small measure of justice arriving 3 decades late. Grace, meanwhile, spent the following days quietly recovering, physically and emotionally, at the estate, the rope marks on her wrists slowly fading to thin pink lines. Daniel visited her every single day, sometimes just to sit with her in silence on the porch, sometimes to talk about everything that had happened, working through it together the way they'd worked through every hard thing before. "You didn't have to tell me about the letter that night," he said one evening, sitting beside her on the porch as the sun set behind the tree line. "You could have waited. I almost died because of it," Grace said with a tired, small smile, wrapping her hands around a warm mug of tea. "I figured that was as good a reason as any to stop waiting." Daniel laughed. A real laugh, the first one since the gala, warm and unguarded. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you in time." Grace reached over and squeezed his hand, the way she had 1,000 times over 15 years, through graduations and funerals and every ordinary Tuesday in between. "You would have kept going. You always do. That's who your mother raised." 3 months passed before Daniel found the courage to ask Grace the question that had been sitting quietly in his chest since that night on the platform, turning it over the way she had once turned over that old letter, waiting for the right moment. It wasn't a question about romance. Their bond had never been that, and both of them understood it never needed to be, a fact that had never once been confusing between them. It was something deeper, something he'd been circling since he was 19 years old, and Grace had shown up at his mother's funeral holding a casserole dish and refusing to let him sit alone in that front pew. "I want to set up a trust," he told her one afternoon, sitting across from her in the estate's small kitchen, the same kitchen where she used to help him study for college exams late into the night, quizzing him on vocabulary words neither of them fully understood at the time. "Not a salary. Not a bonus. A real trust in your name permanently. And I want to put your name on the deed for the cottage on the east side of the property. Not staff housing. Worse. Officially, with your name on the paper and nobody else's." Grace opened her mouth to protest, the same way she always did whenever kindness came her way too directly, an old habit born from a lifetime of being told not to expect too much. "Daniel, that's not necessary. I don't need." "I know you don't need it," he interrupted gently, leaning forward. "That's not the point. You've spent 15 years making sure I never felt alone in this world. You almost lost your life because you were trying to protect me from a truth you thought might hurt me. I'm not asking you to accept this because you need it, Grace. I'm asking you to accept it because you deserve it, and because I should have done this years ago." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She quickly tried to blink away, pressing the back of her hand to her mouth. "Your mother would be so proud of the man you turned into. She'd be proud of both of us," Daniel said quietly, reaching across the table to take her hand. None of this, the company, the life I built. None of it means anything if the person who helped me survive the hardest years of my life is just staff. You stopped being that a long time ago, Grace. Your family. It's time everyone, including the paperwork, finally reflects that. Word of what Vanessa had done eventually settled into the past, replaced by a new story that spread instead through the same social circles that had once gossiped about the engagement. Not of scandal, but of loyalty. Of a housekeeper who nearly lost her life protecting the truth for a man who wasn't even blood. And a billionaire who valued that loyalty more than any business alliance his family name could offer. A story that made even hardened businessmen quietly reconsider who they trusted in their own homes. A year later, Ridgeline Station hosted another gathering. Smaller this time, quieter, without cameras or crowds of investors watching every move. Just close friends, a handful of staff who had become like family over the years. And Grace's sister visiting from Georgia with her 2 kids in tow, wide-eyed at the size of the station's marble halls. It wasn't a wedding. Daniel wasn't engaged again, not yet, though he'd started seeing someone new. A woman named Elena who worked as a pediatric nurse and had absolutely no interest in mergers or business alliances, who had laughed the first time someone mentioned his net worth as though it were a mildly interesting piece of trivia rather than the most important thing about him. This gathering was simpler than that. It was a celebration Daniel had planned quietly, without telling Grace exactly what it was for, only that he needed her there, dressed nicely, no excuses. Standing beneath the same restored brass clock where, exactly 1 year earlier, she had nearly lost everything, Grace watched as Daniel unveiled a small brass plaque mounted near the entrance of Platform 3, the very platform where he had found her, where the rope marks had once cut into her wrists. It read, "In honor of Grace Whitfield, whose loyalty was tested and never broken. Some family isn't chosen by blood. It's chosen by love." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, tears finally spilling freely as the small crowd around her applauded softly. Her sister reaching over to squeeze her shoulder. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered to Daniel, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he said, echoing her own words back to her from months before, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's exactly why I did. If this story taught us anything, it's this. True loyalty is never about status, and true family is never only about blood. Sometimes the people who show up for us in our darkest moments, the ones who ask for nothing in return, are worth more than every fortune in the world combined. Kindness, honesty, and loyalty will always outlast greed and deception, even when it takes everything to prove it. If this story moved you even a little, give it a like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and share it with someone who believes real family is built through love, not blood. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.